Hello, my name is Mairead Macaulay. I'm a lecturer in classics at UCL, University College London. I specialise in the study of gender in Roman literature and culture, particularly in the early imperial period. And my most recent book was called Reproducing Rome, which was a study of the representation of motherhood in Latin literature. As this lecture series is tying in with the current exhibition at the British Museum on the Roman Emperor Nero, my lecture today will be on Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Nero, fact and fiction. Famous since late antiquity as the ultimate depraved Roman emperor, Nero's reign has begun to be reassessed as not all bad, as with, for example, the current British Museum exhibition. Our literary sources, mostly Roman historians from the minority senatorial class who suffered most under his rule, writing decades after Nero's death, accuse him of heinous crimes. But by setting these sources against archaeological, material, and economic and inscriptional evidence, we're able to complicate this picture. We know that Nero was beloved by much of the populace, and for at least part of his reign, he governed effectively. Indeed, thinking through and about the agendas and biases of our sources, rather than just dismissing them as untrue, can actually illuminate a great deal about evolving attitudes to the relatively new institution of the Roman Principate, about its political culture, and about its relationship to other traditional Roman institutions of power, such as the family, religion, class, and structures of patronage. Crucial to understanding this new political culture under the Principate, I'll argue, is gender. The Principate, in particular, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, elevated women, certain women, to unprecedented levels of public and political power. And this phenomenon generated immense ideological tension, clashing with traditional Roman attitudes to women, to the family, and to gender roles. It also exposed the fissures and inconsistencies in the institution itself and the ways in which Augustus and later emperors sought to legitimize it. So in this lecture, I want to introduce a general audience to the dark, operatic, contested life of Agrippina, the woman whose tenacity, intelligence, and canny political maneuverings put the teenage Nero into power in the first place. Classicists sometimes play the game of name the text you'd most like to have survived from antiquity. And as a feminist scholar, one of the texts I'd like most to read are the lost memoirs of Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero. We know that she wrote them and that they were used as a source by Cornelius Tacitus, probably the most famous historian of Nero's reign, who was writing some 50 years later. As he says, Agrippina handed down to posterity the story of her life and of the misfortunes of her family. Julia Agrippina was the great-granddaughter of Augustus. She was the sister of the Emperor Caligula. She was the wife of Claudius and the mother of Nero. So she connected through her bloodline all 5 emperors of the Julio-Claudians, which was the first dynasty of Roman emperors. Moreover, her role as a participant at the heart of imperial rule for 3 generations was unprecedented. She was ambitious, and she was intelligent, and she understood her dynastic importance, and she wielded enormous political power and influence in a time when there were no formal constitutional roles for women to do so. Her achievement, in the words of her biographer Anthony Barrett, was to be empress in an empire that allowed only emperors. Yet the main Roman literary sources we have for her life, the historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, saw her power as a horrifying aberration of natural order. Tacitus, in particular, the outstanding historical source of the early imperial period, seems to be torn between a kind of loathing and a fascination for her. until recently, modern historians, mostly men, have tended to agree with this harsh verdict of a woman who dared to be ambitious and was therefore, quote, greedy for power. Famously, Ronald Syme described her as truculent and violent, loathsome and treacherous, in the words of another 20th century historian. As Anthony Barrett notes in his more balanced biography, this doesn't quite tally with the other historical records. Her influence on both Claudius and Nero seems to have been to direct them towards effective policies of good relations with the army, with the people, and with the Senate, moving the institution of the Principate away from an increasingly oppressive trajectory and towards a relatively benign partnership between ruler and ruled, though even Barrett himself concluded that Agrippina was a distinctly unattractive individual. So I'm going to consider whether it's possible to disentangle some of the fictions around her, and I would also consider the ideological functions of her many and diverse representations. In the process, I'll try to convey her historical importance, not only to our understanding of Nero's reign, but to our understanding of the institution of the Roman Principate itself, that is, a dynastic empire that would ultimately endure for hundreds of years. Much of the theatricality of accounts of the Julio-Claudians, which made them appealing to later writers of operas, tragedies, Hollywood movies, and prestige TV series, centers around the transgressive role of women in royal dynastic politics as plotters, seducers, and even murderers. When we now think of Roman imperial women, Agrippina really defines the category. Her story is marked by ruthlessness and ambition, conspiracy and seduction, poison and incest, the ultimate extremes, and in the end, her own murder at the order of her own son. So the lurid stories about her are inseparable from those of Nero himself, everybody's favorite crazy emperor, the epitome of the corruption and decadence of Rome. Their reputations are intertwined. Agrippina is responsible for his rise to power, and she's also partly blamed for his actions. As with Nero, so much of what we think we know about Agrippina is actually a consequence of heavily biased sources written decades after her time. As I said, Tacitus and Suetonius primarily, writing 50 years later, and also Cassius Dio, who's writing 150 years later. So Agrippina has become more fictional than real, more demonized stereotype of an irrational, perverted, and power-hungry witch than a flesh and blood woman who turns adversity and trauma into ambition and real political power. She's depicted as the embodiment of moral depravity, and she's used by these historians to symbolize the political and moral degeneracy of the whole imperial regime. Alongside the hostile picture from the ancient historians, we can set the unprecedented array of visual depictions of Agrippina, her iconographical representation on coins and statuary, in which her image is glorified as propaganda for the successive reigns of her male relatives. And you can see here, we have a gold coin issue with Agrippina and Nero facing each other on one side. In all of these representations, whether she's vilified or glorified, Agrippina is more symbol than real historical woman. And so one wonders how her version of her story would have complicated these representations. Did she really, for example, call her memoirs On the Misfortunes of My Life? So what do we know about her? Agrippina was born in 15 AD into Rome's first family, just after the death of the first emperor Augustus and the succession of his stepson Tiberius. After the assassination of Julius Caesar and the subsequent civil wars, Augustus had attained sole rulership and essentially established a kind of monarchy. Dynastic politics was instituted by Augustus, but was established through women, as he had no male heir. His daughter Julia's sons were marked as heirs, and then when they died, his wife Livia's son Tiberius, he adopted Tiberius. So Agrippina Minor, or the Younger, was the daughter of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder. She was related to Augustus's wife Livia through her father Germanicus, who was a son of Drusus, Tiberius's brother, and the grandson of Livia, the wife of Augustus. Germanicus was a glamorous, successful general, He was much loved by his soldiers and the populace, and he was tipped for the top job. Late in his reign, Augustus forced Tiberius to adopt him as his heir. Agrippina's mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the granddaughter of Augustus himself through his daughter Julia and his friend and statesman Marcus Agrippa. Agrippina the Younger was a formidable figure. Just like her popular and dashing husband, she embodied the ideals of the Augustan principate, but from a feminine perspective. She was fertile with many children and had a reputation of austere morality, which tallied with that propounded by Augustus himself. She was even said to have deflected a mutiny in the Roman legion's camp in Germany, and another time was said to have prevented panicking soldiers from abandoning a bridge in the middle of battle by exhorting them from horseback. So Agrippina Minor was born in AD 14 or 15 at the beginning of Tiberius's reign at an outpost on the Rhine on the borders of the empire, where her father was in command of the legions. She was the fourth of 6 children. One of her older brothers would be the Emperor Caligula, and the other 2 would fall victim to a plot later in Tiberius's reign. Now, her early years were marked by intrigue, insecurity, and trauma. Her father died while on official duties in Syria in AD 19, and his death was greeted with a great outpouring of grief, and rumors started that he had been killed by a conspiracy involving the governor of Syria, Calpurnius Piso, and his wife Plancina, but at the behest of Tiberius himself, who was jealous of Germanicus's popularity. Now, if this was true, Agrippina the Elder would have been in grave danger, but in an inspired public relations move, she brought Germanicus's ashes home from Syria by sea. Her ship landed at Brundisium and was met by a huge crowd as she disembarked, clutching the ashes. She had her hair loose. She was exhausted, downcast, surrounded by her children. She was the very image of a grieving, devoted Roman widow, and the crowd apparently spontaneously wept and wailed. And the news spread throughout the empire. One scholar has compared the public impact of the funeral of Germanicus to that of Princess Diana. And indeed, this image of a mourning imperial wife and mother was to have a huge influence throughout the history of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. On her arrival in Rome, Agrippina was conspicuously not met by the Emperor Tiberius and his mother Livia. And after the ashes were interred in the mausoleum of Augustus, crowds gathered in the city and called for the gods to protect Agrippina and her family from the emperor's persecution. So she assumed, because of the support of the people, great significance and symbolic power. It's clear that Agrippina believed that her husband's death had been on the orders of the emperor, and that her children's rights as Julio-Claudian heirs had been taken away as a consequence of this dynastic feud, which she also saw as partially waged by Livia in favor of her Claudian children as opposed to Julian, i.e. from Augustus's line. So Agrippina the Elder was proud, she was full of fire, she, in Tacitus's word, knew no feminine weakness and was herself revered as the last descendant of Augustus. And she became a stubborn and abrasive figure, a kind of thorn, a public thorn in the side of Tiberius, who was a paranoid and sort of painfully private and traditionalist ruler. By all accounts, they hated each other. And she was the biggest influence on her daughter, Agrippina the Younger, who both emulated her and learned from her mistakes. So Agrippina the Younger grew up under the shadow of the hostility between the emperor and her mother, her mother built this formidable factional support within the Senate. And all of that culminated when Agrippina the Younger was a teenager, with her mother being sent to exile with her elder sons and then imprisoned. And at one point, Agrippina the Elder was so savagely beaten that she lost an eye. In 29, it seems that she couldn't take it anymore and she starved herself to death. And her son Drusus was also starved, although against his will, and he was said to have even tried to eat the stuffing in his mattress. Her other son, Nero, was given a choice to be murdered or to fall on his sword, and he chose the latter. So even allowing for the possibility of some gruesome embellishment here on the part of the historians, by the time Agrippina was 16, she had lost most of her family in horrific circumstances. She'd also been married since the age of about 13 at the orders of Tiberius to a man about 20 or 30 years older than her, Gaius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Now, this was an honorable marriage. Domitius was the grandson of Augustus's sister Octavia. He was an ex-consul and he was from noble stock. Suetonius, in his biography of Nero, describes Domitius as, quote, hateful in every way. And he tells several horrifying stories about Domitius's impulsive cruelty, such as running over a child in his carriage. Even taking Suetonius's artistic license into account, he's using the idea of a psychopathic father to foreshadow his son Nero's allegedly psychopathic tendencies when emperor, like father, like son. Domitius still seems like a pretty unpleasant character. So Agrippina remains absent from our sources for the rest of Tiberius's reign, and that may reflect strategic self-preservation given the antipathy that Tiberius had for her mother. Tiberius did take to one of her family, and that was her brother Gaius, aka Caligula, or Little Boots. And he brought Gaius to his hideaway on the island of Capri, where Tiberius spent the remainder of his reign sequestered, grooming the young man for succession. Agrippina comes back into the picture in 37 CE when her husband Domitius is named as one of the many aristocratic men involved in a lurid court case about adultery among various aristocratic families. And he's then charged with incest with his sister Domitia Lepida. And the whole thing looks like a cover for a succession plot, as the case is being prosecuted by the Praetorian prefect Macro, an ally of Caligula, and Domitius, given his lineage, might have been a rival for the throne, helped by the fact that his father was so universally beloved by the people and crucially the army, that is Caligula. And so Agrippina the Younger finds herself, with Caligula's rise to power, the sister of the emperor, and ultimately one of the most important women in the Roman world. So Caligula immediately goes about rehabilitating and honoring the memory of his father, his late mother, and his brothers through coin issues and festivals, thus differentiating himself from the unloved Tiberius. And he celebrates his Julian family, especially his sisters, Drusilla, Livia, and Agrippina. The three sisters were given Vestal Virgin privileges. The Vestals were the only public women in Rome with a formal state role. Their job was to tend the fire of the goddess Vesta, which represented Roman power and continuity. The Vestals were viewed as on a par with the highest priest of Jupiter, and they had numerous rights and privileges which women didn't have otherwise. They were legally sui juris, they had an official entourage led by a lictor, and they had seats of honor at plays and festivals. Their bodies were sacrosanct. Touching them was punishable by death. So Agrippina was now a sacred object and a public person. She and her sisters were now also included in prayers for the well-being of the empire and the emperor, and they were inserted into the ritual formula that the Senate spoke when they introduced a motion that is favor and good fortune attend Gaius and his sisters. So what can we conclude from these unprecedented public and formal roles? Well, it seems that Gaius wanted his sisters to be viewed as part of his the Roman state. They were inserted openly into the center of politics. As one historian has noted, a citizen's oath of loyalty was now not just to the emperor, but to his sisters too. They even got their own coinage. And you can see here on this particular slide, we've got a sestertius with the head of Caligula and his three sisters, and they are depicted symbolically as the goddesses Securitas, Concordia, and Fortuna. Securitas is Agrippina. So this is the first image of Agrippina. And in fact, Gaius is apparently the first to put a living woman on a coin. And this image sets the tone for much of the Roman Principate and how the regime would exploit and manipulate the images of imperial woman as a way of communicating values and ideals between ruler and ruled. So she and her sister here are used as symbols of continuity with the previous generation, symbols of fertility, and this recalls her mother Agrippina the Elder, and her famous fecundity, and of course that's also Caligula's mother. Agrippina and her sister also appear in honored position alongside their brother at the celebrations of the inauguration of the Temple of Augustus. So again, the symbolism is heavy. Agrippina is pregnant at the time, and you can really see the political advantage, the good optics of putting on display to the whole Roman people the sort of fertility of Augustus's bloodline, a kind of way of connecting visibly past and future in Agrippina's body, as it were. So on the one hand, Caligula was only extending a precedent which had been set by Augustus himself in the later part of his reign, and one which continued when Tiberius came to power. So it's worth pausing here to consider the way in which Augustus had managed his family image. For the first period of his sole rule, Augustus kept the women of his family out of view, and this seems to have been part of his claim to restore a traditional republican order and values. And in reaction to what some have argued was a kind of uncomfortable prominence during the triumviral period and the civil wars of ambitious women such as Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony. So there's a sort of retrenchment from the sort of visibility and prominent public roles of prominent political sort of maneuverings of women in that period. But from about 12 BC, he starts to kind of experiment with with a certain kind of restrained public representation of his womenfolk. He starts to present his rule as that of a kind of pater familias of the Roman people. The women and children of his family begin to appear now and then on coins and on monuments, such as the famous Ara Pacis, or the Altar of Peace, which was inaugurated in the year 2. So although Augustus was markedly reticent about having his wife Livia depicted publicly in Rome itself, she was given formal honors. She had a prominent power-broking role in the imperial court, and she promoted various religious cults. And after Augustus's death, Livia's image becomes more prominent too, through more coinage, statue groups, honors, and cult forms all over the empire. And this is perhaps, in a way, a means of legitimizing Tiberius's rule, as she's a physical connection to Augustus, because of course he was adopted by Augustus. He wasn't his biological son. But the question here is, who was driving this public representation? Was it Livia herself, or was it Tiberius? What was the power that Livia really had? Certainly she had considerable traditional aristocratic authority as a Roman mater filias. She would have her role would have been to organize and supervise the household, the slaves, the freedmen. She would have, her authority would have included interceding between her family and other families, brokering marriages perhaps. And during the Republic, these female roles were key to establishing alliances between elites. So they were kind of the backroom kind of maneuverings between political and social groupings. But now, Livia's household was the imperial household, which was managing and organizing affairs of the entire state. So after Augustus, politics really equals family. Her power and her influence were therefore unimaginable prior to Augustus's reign. And as Beth Severy-Hoven puts it, in this new conception of the state, some women, such as Livia, outranked even aristocratic men, a situation not in keeping with traditional aristocratic sensibilities. So even with Livia, we have this kind of tension and paradox between a kind of traditional feminine stereotype of maternity and fecundity, which she is embodying, and also her increasingly public and prominent role, which is radically new. And perhaps that's why the honors and prominent public presence she seems to have had caused some tension with Tiberius. There's a great emphasis on her traditional feminine characteristics and domestic virtues. But even this is unprecedented. Women were supposed to remain modest and chaste, but to do so in private, enclosed within the household, hidden from the public gaze. And although Livia obviously embodied that kind of feminine modesty, chastity, and sort of moral integrity, Livia was embodying these virtues publicly and being celebrated formally and publicly for that. And that's the paradox. So to return to Caligula and Agrippina, Caligula's public celebration of his closeness to his sisters was recast later as a bit too close. So as Suetonius says, he lived in the habit of incest with all his sisters. And at the table, when much company was present, he placed each of them in turns below him while his wife reclined above him. And this is the first crime that is laid by Roman historians at Agrippina's door, and it's no coincidence that it's a sexual one. Using public images of female relatives to legitimate a ruler's political position is something that we're familiar with from other royal dynasties, but it's still new to this heavily masculine, militaristic political culture of ex-Republican Rome. So although Augustus had begun this process in a kind of restrained way, Caligula is now going considerably further. And so, but trumped up charges of sexual impropriety and perversion were nothing new to Roman political culture. They were part of a time-honored tradition of political invective. For example, in Cicero's speech in defense of Caelius from the turbulent final decades of the Republic, he accuses Caelius's ex-mistress, a woman named Claudia, of incest with her brother, who was the infamous political agitator and Cicero's arch-enemy Claudius. So just as the emperor used images of his womenfolk symbolically to shore up his own dynastic role, so too did those less enamored with the principate. Even historians writing decades later use these women for their own symbolic and political messaging. And of course, accusations of sexual appetites and uncontrollable perversity is the quickest and easiest way to sort of denigrate and delegitimize an institution that is partly deriving its legitimacy from the bloodlines of women. And yet public art, monuments and statuary were also where one might discern some of the real power that imperial women might wield too. So returning to the young Agrippina, ultimately she falls foul of the increasingly unstable Gaius, accused of conspiracy to overthrow him. She's exiled with her sister Livilla to the Pontine Islands. Now, inevitably, Caligula is killed, and in 41, his uncle Claudius is put on the throne. So Claudius is an interesting figure. He had some kind of disability, a stammer, a limp, and he had been considered an embarrassment to the family. But he becomes emperor. And now Agrippina begins to feature more prominently in sources when it comes to her marriage to Claudius. She begins to exercise her political muscle. She moved first to disrupt the planned marriage of the emperor's daughter Octavia. So incest with his sister proved toxic enough to torpedo the wedding. And readers of Robert Graves's picaresque and hugely popular I, Claudius novels are unlikely to forget the alleged sexual gymnastics of Messalina, Claudius's notorious wife. And you can see here on the slide, we've got Claudius depicted as Jupiter. We've got Messalina Britannicus in a very sort of traditional pose, embodying, as I was talking about, the sort of fertility, continuity, modesty, and chastity of the imperial family. And then we've got a later depiction of Messalina with something like an attitude. So Messalina has exercised huge fascination for later artists, writers, and so on. In the end, Messalina's antics brought her down, leaving a vacancy in the marriage bed that Agrippina filled in AD 49. Shortly thereafter, Claudius adopted Nero as his own son, making Nero a legitimate claimant to the throne alongside Claudius's natural son, Britannicus. So the logic of Agrippina's and Claudius's marriage is clear. As both a Julian and a Claudian, she could unite the two branches of the family, as well as bring into the household her son, an ideal potential successor. The only problem was that they were closely related. Their union was viewed as scandalous, indeed incestuous, by the historians whose reports we're following. Tacitus alleges the marriage was all down to her manipulation and ambition to get around the problem of illegality and incest. She devised a scheme whereby the freedman Vitellius petitioned the Senate on her behalf for the marriage to be legalized. And others argue that it was actually driven by Claudius or his freedom, but it's clear that Tacitus wants to make Agrippina the origin of the idea and the ambition for the marriage itself. So the stage is set. Agrippina has managed everything with steely efficiency. Now, Tacitus says in one of his most interesting passages on Agrippina, from this moment, the country was transformed. Complete obedience was accorded to a woman, and not a woman like Messalina, who toyed with national affairs to satisfy her appetites. This was a rigorous, almost masculine despotism. In public, Agrippina was austere and often arrogant. Her private life was chaste unless there was power to be gained. Her passion to acquire money was unbounded. She wanted it as a stepping stone to supremacy. I'll return to that passage at the end of my lecture, but because it tells us a lot about the kind of work Agrippina is doing for Tacitus within the text, that he is within his own critique of the Principate. So Claudius died in AD 54 after eating a mushroom that was either bad or poisoned. Tacitus and the ancients mention that he might have been poisoned on Agrippina's orders, and while there's no hard proof, the story has stuck. In either case, Agrippina has greased the succession machine so that Nero, who's just 17 years old, slides smoothly onto the throne following Claudius's death, past the slightly younger Britannicus, Claudius's son, by Messalina. So Nero was a teenager who found himself in charge of an enormous multilingual world empire. Agrippina had ensured he had the Stoic philosopher Seneca as tutor and a level-headed Burrus as commander of the Praetorian Guard. And between the three of them, an imperial administration of the empire, an imperial administration of well-trained, competent freedmen and senators, the administration of the empire went pretty smoothly, it seems, for the first 5 years, while Nero could spend much of his time on cultural pursuits. So the reputation of Nero as a bloodthirsty and monstrous emperor does not tally with the account of his lyre-playing, Greek culture-loving time in these 5 years. He was not interested in imperial conquest or war. He was dedicated to chariot racing, poetry, and musical training. Suetonius says of him, he conscientiously undertook all the usual exercises for strengthening and developing his voice. He would also lie on his back with a slab of lead on his chest. He would use enemas and emetics to keep down his weight. And he would refrain from eating apples and every other food considered deleterious to vocal cords. Suetonius adds casually that Nero's voice remained feeble and husky. It's possible that Nero's love of theatrical performance and racing and his lack of interest in war and conquest, the kind of things that Roman leaders were supposed to do, it's possible that's part of what fuels later historians' blackening of his reputation, their tendency to label him as effete and decadent. So he's not fulfilling the traditional expectations of what a Roman leader should do. He's not militaristic. He's not especially masculine. He embraces his feminine side. And it's clear that the populace loved him, his exuberant personality, his sort of fun public appearances, and his evident talent. One doesn't drive a chariot without having some basic ability. So the reign of terror about Nero is still being debated. We do know that Britannicus died in 51, according to the sources, murdered. Although later historians, like contemporary historians, have questioned the extent of the kind of bloodlust, as a recent work on Nero by John Drinkwater has it. If you count up the murders, even after the Pisonian conspiracy of 64, there were not that many. So again, this is all under debate. Nero's marriage to his relative Octavia was unsuccessful. He fell for Acte, a freedwoman, and Agrippina's open disapproval of this relationship and of his friends and hangers-on generates what seems to be a kind of teenage resentment. His mother comes to seem like a bit of a downer, an obstacle to what he really wants to do with his life. And the historians plant a lot of the blame on her. She's too controlling. She even tried to greet foreign ambassadors on the same platform as her son. This is considered a major no-no and a shocking sort of flouting of tradition, because, dealing with foreign regimes was a man's sphere. There are rumors that she exploits her closeness to her son by trying to seduce him, thereby sort of securing her power over him, her potentia, as Tacitus says. And then other stories are that it was the other way around. Nero was actually fixated on her. Suetonius and Dio claim that she made herself so enticing to Nero to the point that he acquired a mistress who bore a striking resemblance to her mother. And they allege that mother and son did actually commit incest. Tacitus is less focused on Agrippina as a kind of debauched woman, as we saw in that quote earlier. He's more interested in her lust for power rather than her lust for sex. As Ronald Symes said, sex is not among the main preoccupations of Tacitus. For the author, quote, knew that ambition is stronger. But in Tacitus's version, Agrippina does use her sexuality for political gain. Nothing unchaste. She did nothing unchaste unless it, quote, assisted her in gaining power. So either way, the relationship with Nero's relationship with Acte drove a wedge between mother and son. And some say that Seneca actually planned that it would, because he was afraid of the consequences of these incest rumors. So Nero ultimately kicks her out of the royal palace. He gets rid of her security, and coins show this increasing distance in the relationship, as you can see here. Nero then falls in love with Poppaea, and Agrippina tries again to intervene. And this is the final straw, it seems. So he decides that she has to go. So why does he have her killed in 59? It's hard to know from the sources. Tacitus says only, quote, finding her intolerable praegrawem, he decided to kill her. Is this because of incest or the shameful rumors of incest that they couldn't control? Whatever the real cause, the matricide story provides such good copy. It's so horrifying, so unnatural, so lurid, so burlesque, melodramatic, tragic, and even darkly comic, that it'll come to define absolutely Nero's representation for the next 2 millennia as the ultimate Roman monster emperor. It exemplifies, it encapsulates the decadence and unnatural corruption of the whole regime, at least in the way that it is told. So Nero invites her to dinner. It's a kind of makeup dinner at his holiday villa in Baiae near Naples. He graciously provides her with a ship to take her home down the coast after their dinner. Little does Agrippina know, the boat is a trap. It's a collapsible boat. And at the right signal, the crew make it collapse. But Agrippina, who knew, turns out to be a good swimmer. Her maid who's drowning in the water, shouts out for help to the crew and claims that she is Agrippina, not very prudently, because the sailors then bash her with the oars and she dies. Again, this sort of crazily sort of black comedy in the narrative. Agrippina is injured, but she manages to swim to shore, now fully aware of the plot to kill her. Nero is desperate. Seneca and Burrus are both horrified and, guilty. After some sort of dithering, his henchman agrees to get the job done and resorts to sending a band of soldiers to finish her off. And when they break into her chamber, Agrippina realizes what's happening. And she says, "If you've come to commit a crime, I cannot believe my son commanded this." She behaves with a sort of characteristic fearlessness. She apparently says, "Feri ventrem, strike my womb," the womb that gave birth to Nero. So afterwards, an elaborate story is concocted to justify her death, that she had been plotting to kill Nero, and once discovered, she had committed suicide in shame. And of course, apparently, according to Tacitus, nobody believes this, but many pretend to believe it, realizing that now the emperor will stop at nothing. There's nobody to stop him. Agrippina was 43 when she died. She died as a mother, and by her own account, she had been forewarned that this was how she would die. Agrippina had known for many years, said Tacitus, that this would be her end, and she had made light of it. For when she sought advice on Nero's future from astrologers, they replied that he would be emperor and he would kill his mother. "Let him kill," she said, "provided that he rules." It's almost like a literary fiction. It's so hard to see a real person behind this wonderful confection, this wonderful character that has been constructed by the historians, this incredible sort of charismatic villain. Her death, at least in the historians' accounts, marks the beginning of a new era. It's the beginning of the end. There is no one now who can stand in the way of the emperor's tyrannical desires and monstrous impulses. He'll stop at nothing. And the consequences of the end of her rule and her death for Nero's reign are hard to ascertain. Some argue that it seems to have accelerated the negative aspects of Nero's rule, his unwillingness to perform his responsibilities, but others contend that the relative smooth running of the empire continued at the hands of a team which was put together partly by Agrippina, Seneca, Burrus, Nero's second wife Poppaea, Tigellinus, and others, and the efficient and competent civil service, his advisors, and so on. They faced considerable difficulties, not least the Great Fire in Rome, but they avoided state bankruptcy, and there was reforms to the coinage and the tax system. So again, the debate is out. Was he all that bad? But even in death, Agrippina remained a source of fascination and a warning to all, a heavily symbolic figure. Both Tacitus and Suetonius record a gruesome anecdote that Nero rushed to view his mother's naked dead body, examining it closely, commending some parts and criticizing others, while simultaneously drinking a glass of wine. Such a grotesque tale as this, I'm just showing you some images, was bound to attract the attention of artists, and there are many representations from the medieval era on of this scene of Nero looking on the body of his dead mother. And some of them add their own twist to the story. Nero sipping at his wine in some, getting uncomfortably close to the body in others, and even in a plethora of rather hideous images, dissecting his mother, which is an episode that is never mentioned by any of the sources. And here we have a manuscript of Boccaccio with Agrippina's open womb on view. And it's kind of hard to escape the symbolism of that. And again, a depiction of Nero dissecting his mother with a sort of vengeful look on his face. The narrative is so full of literary stereotypes, contradictions, so full of this crafted black horror and exaggeration. And it's impossible for us to fully dissect fact from fiction. We'll never know if Agrippina poisoned Claudius. We'll never know if she ever seduced those freedmen. We'll never know if she committed incest with her son. We do know that that her honorific titles were not removed after her death. There's a case to be made that the rift between mother and son is an exaggeration and that they actually were reasonably close. Some historians wonder if, rather than Nero ordering her death, other people around him seized the opportunity to get rid of Agrippina as they themselves sought influence and power. What we can ask is why there is such a lurid depiction of Agrippina. Is she a scapegoat? What's at stake? Well, we can say a number of things. After the Julio-Claudian era, there was a civil war, and out of it emerged the Flavian emperors, Vespasian and his sons Titus, and then Domitian. And this is a new dynasty trying to establish itself by destroying the memory of the original imperial family, denigrating them as corrupt and depraved as a family. So Nero is depicted in terms that echo in the negative the first princeps, which Augustus. He's a sort of anti-Augustus. He's a sort of logical and horrifying conclusion to what Augustus started. And Agrippina, for Tacitus, exemplifies the heart of the rot, the corruption at the heart of the despotic system. In Roman society, the paterfamilias exercised absolute authority over his family, and he had a duty to maintain the moral propriety of his household. In the case of the princeps, the emperor, Claudius and Nero are both paterfamilias and pater patriae, father of the country. And if the emperor cannot control his own house, his own women, he is surely incapable of controlling an entire state. The household is a microcosm of the state. And as Judith Ginsburg says, the welfare of the latter depends on the integrity of the former. So Agrippina's death and the strike to the womb perfectly illustrates the symbolic role of the mother that she was expected to perform. Her body acts as a symbol of the integrity of the patriarchal family. It's hard to peel back the layers of misogyny and work out what really happened, what she was really like. And that's why her own version, in her own words, would have offered a fascinating insight and even a corrective to all the demonization. And yet we can discern, even in Tacitus's hostile account, a certain acknowledgement of her intelligence, her ruthless ambition, and her undoubted talents as a ruler after her marriage to her uncle Claudius. He talks about how she transformed the country. She occurred complete obedience. She didn't toy with national affairs to satisfy her appetites. She had a rigorous, almost masculine despotism. And that's really interesting that he calls her almost masculine. Agrippina was the woman who almost, but never quite became emperor. In the representations we have of her, she flouts the patriarchal rules of imperial Rome by aspiring to rule herself, and she does it like a man. She is austere, she is calculating, she is self-controlled and utterly ruthless. These are all ideals of masculinity in Roman culture. A woman acting like a powerful man was guaranteed to send shivers down the spine of any traditional patriarchal Roman. To them, she's even more of a freak than the sex-crazed Messalina. Women were supposed to be uncontrolled in their emotions and their appetites for sex, for luxury. This stereotype serves to justify to Romans why womenfolk should be constrained and sequestered within the Roman patriarchal family. You couldn't let these silly, uncontrollable women loose on real responsibility and power. But this wasn't Agrippina. She might have been cruel. She might have committed incest, adultery, who knows? But she did it for strategic reasons. She was playing the long game. So even if you disbelieve all the extreme stories about sex and murder, Agrippina seems hard to like. But in a world where women couldn't hold real political power and where Julio-Claudian daughters and wives could be married off or done away with at the whim of their menfolk, what she managed to achieve was formidable. She was also extremely vulnerable. She had no troops to support her, nor had she a constitutional position. Tacitus remarks of Agrippina when her fall from Nero's favor becomes clear and she's deserted by her entourage. He says, nothing in the world is as flimsy and fleeting as reputation gained for power that has no strength of its own. She had power, but she had no strength. She had no formal role. So she shows herself an effective leader. It's generally agreed. She reconciled Claudius's relations with the Senate. She established loyalty of the Praetorian Guard for both Claudius and at least partially Nero. She understood the imperial system, and she worked with rather than against it. Agrippina aspired, it seems possible, to establish the possibility that Rome might be ruled by a woman. The Julio-Claudian Principate, as John Drinkwater has noted, had lasted almost a century since Augustus, but it hasn't solidified into a fixed form. How emperors are made was still up in the air. If we think of how Claudius becomes emperor, hiding behind a curtain, it's not clear how the succession works. It might be lineage, it could also be adoption, or, as after the fall of Nero, it could be civil war. Given that, one wonders whether the empire might have lost out by not having a place for an empress, Agrippina. Thank you very much.